Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Tim and Hilary, our social media coordinator, with another Dr. Tim's Aquatics podcast. And today we're talking about quarantine tanks. How you doing today, Hilary?
Woohoo. Doing good, doing good. Sitting here drinking my coffee in my Dr. Tim's coffee mug. Perfect way to start the day.
Yes. So quarantine tanks, if you are a gambler, you don't use them. And more than likely, you'll lose. Especially with the saltwater fish, they just seem to be, in my opinion, more susceptible. I mean, it's getting better because less and less are wild caught, and the aquacultured saltwater fish don't seem to have as many of the disease problems. But still, I'm a firm believer in quarantine tanks, even to the extent of freshwater fish. In the lab here, we quarantine new arrivals. We don't put them into the test. We don't put them in our display tanks. They all go into a quarantine system, freshwater or saltwater fish.
Nice. Yeah, I too am a firm believer of quarantine. I don't know. I just, over the years, the different fish stores that I've worked in, there's no way a fish would be going in my system, any of my systems, until after it was quarantined.
Right. So the purpose of quarantine, you've got your main tank. You've spent a lot of time, of course, a lot of money and effort setting it all up. If you just are at the store and you see this fish, it's on your gotta have list, and you take that urge and you buy it and you just plop it in the tank, that fish could definitely be a carrier of parasites, of bacteria diseases, of viruses, all sorts of things. And I think anybody that's been in this hobby and has violated the quarantine rule will tell you, I'd say 99% chance you're going to have a bad experience.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, like you talk about, putting fish in, but really I feel like it only takes like a couple of drops of water, like transferring water in between tanks. Like even that can cause it. Like it doesn't have to be a lot.
No, it doesn't. It's fish, it's corals, really anything. And in a strict lab that I used to run, each tank had its own nets. You didn't go with your hands, which you wore gloves from one tank to another without disinfecting, because all this stuff, like you're saying, just a little bit of water can move to another tank, and something there, a fish is susceptible, and it just wipes the whole thing out.
Yep. Rather not risk it. You invest a whole bunch of money and time and effort into all of this. I don't know. It just seems to me better to play it safe.
Right. And even, when I was at Marineland and we had a huge fish room, what I found was in the summertime, certain live foods like the worms, which came out of terrible conditions, we weren't thinking about that. We didn't quarantine against that, and we would start experiencing wipeouts. So in the summertime, we stopped feeding live food like that.
Oh.
And it solved the problem. We eliminated that, because how do you quarantine live, worms and things like that? It was just too difficult. So we stopped feeding live foods.
It's funny you mentioned that. When I first got into the hobby back when I lived in South Carolina, I had an apartment right on the marsh, and I had a little burrfish, a little pufferfish, and I would go out to the marsh and collect food for him because he loved fiddler crabs and I could get those. And I'm fairly certain that was his downfall, because just who knows what was out there in the marsh.
Yep.
I think I introduced something and learned my lesson the hard way.
Yep. So let's talk about a quarantine tank, a setup. It doesn't have to, the good news is it does not have to be complicated. Okay?
No.
I recommend it. If you get 5 fish, you need to quarantine all 5 fish. So people will say, well, what size tank? Well, are you going to be quarantining a lot of fish all the time? Are you going to do one fish at a time? It really depends upon the number of fish. I think a 20-gallon tank is plenty, in my opinion. But again, it just depends on your individual situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like how big of a tank? I think my quarantine tank was 30 gallons,
Yeah.
but yeah.
One thing to remember, I mean, why size of the tank is important is because if you're going to be adding medications, whatever it is, the larger the tank, the more medication you're going to add because you're treating in a grams or milligrams per liter or per gallon. And so if you have just say I'm going to get a 50-gallon quarantine tank, but it's for a small fish, you've got to treat 50 gallons of water. With all these treatments, you have to get up to a therapeutic dose. And so with a larger tank volume, that means you're actually putting more of the medicine in there. Do you really need to do that?
Yeah.
So once you have the tank, put it someplace where there's not a lot of traffic. You don't really need a lot of light, but you are going to need enough light or a flashlight, something to observe the fish. You have to observe the fish during the quarantine period
Yes.
carefully. You just can't put it in there and then not really pay attention to it.
No, that's a good point. And I think you should be observing your fish fairly closely on a regular base anyway. So just consider this an extension of what you would normally do.
Right, but I like to actually get in with a flashlight and
Oh,
really
okay.
look well because then you can see, are the scales raised? Do you have a parasite on there? I don't know that many people are going to do gill scrapings. So how do the gills look? Just the fish is really going to tell you how it's doing if you look at it.
Yep.
So what is quarantine? Quarantine is having a separate system, a separate tank that has, we're going to go through this, a basic setup very much different than your display tank. I prefer glass aquarium. It needs to have filtration. You want to be able to add activated carbon, but you want to definitely be able to remove it. Whatever your activated carbons, if it's a filter pad or whatever it is, bag, you need to be able to remove it from the system.
Oh.
Aeration, a lot of people don't like air stones because they bubble at the top and cause salt spray, but you definitely are going to need aeration, and that's usually an air stone is good because you're going to be possibly treating these fish and that causes stress, so you want to make sure you have a good oxygen level in the system.
Yep. I don't typically have air stones on my tank, but my quarantine tank always has an air stone because I think too that there's medications out there that will in some way cause the oxygen to be used up a little bit more, and they encourage you to add air stones. So that
Definitely, yeah. You definitely there are some medications that have an oxygen demand alone, and so you need to have supplemental aeration. As I say, I prefer to set the tank up where there's not a lot of traffic because you're bringing in a new fish. It's not settled down. And one thing you'll see is you can't have a lot of decorations. We'll go over that. But in a quarantine tank, because the medications can be removed by calcareous-based substances like coral substrate, coral sand, live rock, those types of things, you're not going to be able to put those in your tank. You want very simple hiding spots where they can hide, but you have to be able to get the fish. Maybe you are going to have to, well, you have to net the fish because you're going to be moving it from your quarantine tank to your display tank, and you don't want to have to tear the whole system apart plus stress the fish so much chasing it around.
Exactly.
Another reason not to oversize the aquarium, for the quarantine tank.
Yep.
A lot of people use PVC pipe. That's fine. There's different substances you can use, but PVC pipes just or fittings that are big enough that the fish can get in and hide are good.
Yep. I like to have some, I've got some PVC pieces, just like spares from when you're plumbing a new tank or whatever. But then I also have some, just like one or two fake plants in there, but I don't have them in any of my other systems, but just a little bit of something. It's easy to take out and clean if I need to. And yeah.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Plus, the fish, if you're doing seahorses, which are terrible for parasites, uh, they've got some place to hide. Think about the fish that you actually have in your quarantine system and what it needs.
Yep.
And don't just think about the bottom. Not all fish are at the bottom, so you need to have something vertical up into the water column.
Exactly.
So there are some stones and rocks and slate that you can use. Just make it so it's easy to remove so that you can clean the tank, because you're going to want to clean it between quarantines.
Yes.
You're going to want, when I'm talking about cleaning, I'm talking about chlorinating it, scrubbing it well, obviously no soap or anything, but you want to clean all this stuff so you're not transferring disease from one quarantine period to another. So, but this brings up, since you have a bare minimum of substrate and decorations, biological filtration.
Yes.
And as we note in our one and only live nitrifying bacteria in the labels, setting up a quarantine tank takes longer to get the biofilter going because there's not a lot of surface area there for the bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
Sponges can work, but you got to get the bacteria into the sponge. So you need to have a strong water pump that's forcing the water and stirring up the water and then forcing it through the sponge so the bacteria can get into the sponge. Which means that you need to set your quarantine tank up several weeks before you have your fish.
Yes.
A lot of times people will, okay, I got a new fish. I'll grab a 5-gallon or a 10-gallon tank and I'll put it in there and we'll go from there. And then they start the quarantine process. Well, the quarantine process is hard on the nitrifying bacteria and it's hard on the fish. And so you end up with elevated levels of ammonia, which are now stressing the fish even further, which leads it to being susceptible to diseases. So you've got this bad circle that you're going in.
Exactly. When I first set up a quarantine tank, or if it's, I've gone through a cycle and I've cleaned it and I'm like resetting it back up, I like to, some of those decorations or whatever, or even at the very beginning before I know I'm putting fish in there, I almost always have some live rock or some sort of spare media in one of my other tanks, and I'll put that in the quarantine tank for a little while to help get it started and reseeded.
Right. So you need to think about that. And once you've set up and established your quarantine tank, used it, then get it set up again. Even if you're not sure you're going to have any fish in it, you can keep it running and just add some drops of ammonia to keep the biofilter going. And or put the biofilter in a smaller body of water. But it shouldn't cost you too much, and it's going to save you a lot of headaches to have that quarantine tank ready. Plus, when we're talking about getting a new fish, maybe something happens in your display tank where a fish isn't looking good. It's been picked on. It's not eating. Something's going on. If you can catch it soon enough, you can net that fish out of the tank, put it in the quarantine tank because it's already ready, it's established, and see how it is. You'll give it time to recoup. Maybe you have to do a treatment. You can catch it maybe before things spread to the other fish and organisms in your display tank. So there's use for the quarantine tank is not just new fish. It can be what's basically a hospital tank for fish that are already in your system that need to be treated.
Exactly. This isn't quite one of the things that was on our topics to talk about, but, we're talking about a specific separate tank for quarantine, but you can also have, I like to call them timeout tanks or timeout boxes that, like, if you're introducing a new fish into your tank, it's not like a full-on separate quarantine tank, but it's like a container some people call them howdy boxes. To like, when you introduce or re-putting a fish back into a tank, or if a fish has been a bully, putting them in like a timeout box inside the main tank so that it's still in there, but it's kind of in still a sense like quarantined away from everybody, that it can't be mean and can't be a bully. So there's also, I guess, that way of quarantining a fish too.
Yes. So we have the tank, minimal decorations, no substrate, or because we were last time about biofilter, what you can do is put a single layer of marbles.
Oh.
Glass works out really well. Bacteria like it. So you can put just one layer of marbles on the bottom and add the nitrifying bacteria, and the marbles you can disinfect when you clean the tank. It's real easy. Put them in a net, or just a big cup, and you can chlorinate them. They're easy to clean. They're easy to capture. It's not like you've got to take a bunch of sand out of the tank. So marbles are a good substrate for the bacteria, for the nitrifying bacteria.
It's a good idea.
Thank you. So now water temp. Now the water temp may vary because some of the disease organisms have a life cycle, and the life cycle is faster when the water temperature is higher. But you've got to make sure that the fish can tolerate that temperature.
Yes.
And it's the same with salinity. You'll read on the internet, which is a great purveyor of half truths, that go with a lower salinity for the fish because the osmotic pressure of the fresher the water, the bacteria, the parasites can't survive. And that's true to a certain extent, but it's not true for all bacteria. It's not true for all parasites. And more importantly, not all saltwater fish can tolerate a lower salinity for a long period of time.
Now, out of curiosity, when you say lower salinity, how low is low?
Well, again, it depends on the fish. We can talk about this like a freshwater dip. Now, that's no salinity, basically. So what a freshwater dip is before you put the fish in the quarantine tank, you take it out of the bag and you put it in a bucket of fresh water, dechlorinated fresh water. This is your saltwater fish going into fresh water. And most fish can tolerate that for a short period of time. And the idea is that this extreme change from salt to fresh will cause the microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, parasites that are on the outside of the fish to basically explode because of the salinity difference.
Yep. And
that is true, but you cannot do this for more than, depending on the fish, a couple of minutes. Unless you have an anadromous fish, which most people aren't keeping striped bass or salmon in their tank. So you need to then go into the quarantine. I like to keep it at about 24, but again, it depends on the fish. Some fish just can't stand that low salinity. 34 parts per thousand being full strength seawater. Can you get down to 20 or 24? And it's not a complete treatment. There are plenty of bacteria. Our saltwater nitrifiers do quite well in fresh water. People didn't believe it, but it's true. We've shown it. And so there's one right there that does quite well. Now the freshwater guys don't do so well in saltwater, but the saltwater bacteria do fine in freshwater. So it's not a complete treatment. It's not perfect, but it can help. But I wouldn't go any lower than maybe 24 parts per thousand.
Good to know.
But that's just my experience, and I haven't kept every fish that's out there.
It's a question I always like to ask people when they're like, "Oh, I lowered my salinity," because there's sometimes like one of the stores that I worked at, they had us drop it so low, and it would always make me so nervous, but 9 times out of 10, we always saw results and fish got better. So
right.
still doing that
Would
in my
say,
home tanks.
yeah. There's kind of a inverse relationship between the lower the salinity, the more you have to be right there to see if the fish starts to get stressed. It's not something where you can lower the salinity and then walk away, or let it be overnight without observing it. So if you're going to go for a low salinity, be there and be observing the fish, and you'll see it starts to stress. It's going to go on its side. You'll notice it that it's stressed, and then you need to get the fish out of there.
Yeah.
So we've gone over the tank the salt. I mean, you need a quality salt, but you don't have to use any special salt, because basically you're going to be throwing that water away when you're done.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. And then for how long? That's a big question. Yeah. Because it really depends on if the fish breaks out in quarantine with a bacteria or parasite infection. To me, that starts the clock over. If you're 10 days in and then it breaks out, well, you're back to day 0. I like to do about 6 weeks. I'm into the longer, a 10 or 14 day quarantine. I know you want to get that fish in there, but it's just not, to me, enough time. You need at least, my experience, at least 4 weeks. 5 weeks is better. Get the fish eating. Right now, they don't have any competition, and you can get them not fat, but you can get them, eating well. You can get them healthy, get the color. They're feeling better. And I just think a little bit longer in the long term, long run, it's going to be better to give the fish an extra week or 2 in quarantine.
Yep. No, I fully agree. I like to, from the first start the clock, you put them in there. If you see something, the clock, like you said, restarts. And then, I almost like to restart the clock like after I stop seeing any signs of anything, and then just give it, 2 or 3 weeks after that point. That way I know, hey, we're not going to have relapses. We're doing good.
Right. And, how do you know it's over? Well, it's not just 35 days or 28 days or whatever. Is the fish eating well? Are there any signs of bacteria diseases? Are there any signs of parasites? Again, observing the fish, they're going to tell you. If they're not eating, if they're hiding all the time and just, fins are clamped and shimmering, there's something wrong. They're not ready to go back into your display tank.
That's a good point. Observing and watching to make sure and see what its behavior is.
Right. And now the, big central topic is what you've got the tank set up. You've got the salinity of the salt. It's all ready. You've freshwater dipped. Now the fish is in the tank. What do you do? Do you prophylactically? So do you treat just to get ahead of anything? Or do you wait to see if something breaks out?
I feel like that's always a tricky question, and it varies depending on who you talk to.
Yeah, it is a tricky question, because you don't know. Sometimes, and the problem is, Dr. Tim's famous saying, the problem is, most hobbyists aren't going to know what the fish has in terms of, is it a bacterial problem? And that's one set of treatments. Is it a parasite? And that's another set of treatments. Or is it viral? That's a third set of treatments. And most people, you just don't have the equipment, the training to know. So what I do like to do with saltwater fish is put copper into the tank. Copper does help. Copper at the therapeutic levels will not kill the nitrifying bacteria. It will slow their reproduction, so that slows their ability to convert ammonia or nitrite, but it won't kill them. So you just have to be careful and not feed as much. Also, don't let the uneaten food sit around.
Yes.
And what if you have? I prefer a hang-on style filter in my quarantine tank where you take the intake and you get it down low, so that you can get stuff off the bottom, and
Oh,
then take that filter pad and rinse it daily. All this material is being trapped on the filter pad. You can take it over to the sink. Don't worry about chlorinating. Your biofilter is somewhere else, and rinse and get that stuff out of there.
that's a good point.
Um, and then that also, if you're siphon cleaning the bottom, that's removing a little water. So if you're doing a copper treatment, you have to keep the levels at the constant therapeutic dose, and
Yes.
that helps.
Now, I would
Next,
recommend, like, if you're doing copper, you should have a good test kit so that you know exactly where you're at. Like, if you do a water change, like, all right, how much more do I need to add? And stuff like that.
yeah, you don't want to be just shooting from the hip with the copper. And then I evaluate the source. If the fish is coming from the wild, you've just gotten it from a store who got it from a wholesaler who had it shipped in somewhere. That fish is pretty stressed. And that it means there's a higher chance of that fish breaking out with something.
Yes.
So you might want to consider a prophylactic where you treat without really knowing or seeing that anything's happened. If you're getting the fish from maybe a breeder or one of these aquaculture places, the chances are pretty good they're keeping their stock clean. It's not perfect, but if they're reputable, they're hopefully, I've never visited any of these places, but they're hopefully cleaning their systems. I used to run a hatchery for hybrid striped bass for food, for aquaculture. And when we switched out a tank, we chlorinate and clean that tank between every batch, because it's poor husbandry to just let things build up. You get slime on the wall, slime on the filter, and that's where these bacteria like to live. So hopefully these aquaculture facilities are doing that same thing where they're keeping their systems clean. And so there's less chance of the fish being stressed, and so having being susceptible to disease, and you can observe it. If the fish is eating, that's great.
Yes.
And I'll put a plug in here for our do-it-yourself beneficial fish food. One of the nice things about that is that it's easy to make your own medicated food.
Yes.
It's well, basically, I think it's impossible now to buy medicated food. Plus, a pellet or a flake food that's been sitting on a shelf with a bunch of medication is probably not any good. So there's recipes out there to make your own medicated food. With our beneficial fish food, once you add the food to the water, the boiling water, stir it, let it cool down, and then add the medication, pour it in the trays, and now you've just made a tray of medicated food. And follow directions. You can find these on vet sites and things like that. Don't overdose the medication, because a lot of it's not very palatable, and so the fish won't eat it because they can taste it.
Yep.
But a great thing to do is feed medicated food, because that gets into the fish
Yes.
internally and helps fight bacteria.
I am a big fan of medicating through food, actually. And I'm going to do a self plug. If you don't know how to make these foods, go to Marine Depot's website, go to Waterlogged on YouTube, and I just released a video on how to make them. And so,
Perfect.
Based on what you've heard here, you can figure out exactly at what point you need to add the medication in. And I've got so much experience with my cowfish getting sick and getting him better because I've used medicated foods. It just works.
Yep, so great. So
Fantastic.
head over there and you can and Hilary will show you how to do it. And then, so you're feeding medicated food. Now, do you treat the whole tank, even though it's 10 or 20 gallons? That's one way to do it. I prefer to do what's called dips.
Ooh.
And because if you're going to treat the cold quarantine tank with any type of medicine, you are stressing the fish. A lot of these medicines stress the fish, and the stressed fish is more susceptible to disease. So one way to do this is what is called a bath. And so you're going to take the medication and put it in a separate 1 gallon. It depends the size of the fish, but you need a small amount that you put at a high concentration. And another reason not to have all these decorations, you net your fish out of your quarantine tank and you move it to the dip or the bath, and you put it in there. This is in salt water, and you put it in there for just a little bit of time. And it depends on the medication you're using, but you put the fish in there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, depending, at the super high concentration. So you're really hitting the disease organism at a high concentration, which is the best thing to do. And then moving the fish back into the quarantine tank and seeing, observing how it's doing.
Yes.
That is, in my opinion, a better way than just adding a bunch of antibiotics to the quarantine tank, because most antibiotics are going to kill the nitrifying bacteria. So now you're going to have to be changing water because you've killed the biofilter. So you're doing a lot of work. And did you even have a bacterial disease? You're not sure. So it's much harder and it's more work, where you could dip the fish in an antibiotic treatment. You could dip the fish in a parasitic treatment, and you still have the quarantine tank where you're observing the fish and feeding the fish and seeing how it's doing before you take a drastic course of action.
Makes sense. Now, here's a question for you. So we have product First Defense. Could you use that at all in any stage of quarantine? Would you recommend putting some First Defense in the quarantine when you first put them in while you're observing?
Yes, I definitely recommend the First Defense. It is a number of different vitamins which help the fish, and an immunostimulant, which basically is stimulating the immune system to go out and look for invaders. The problem with many of these bacterial, pathogenic bacteria, is they have what's called quorum sensing. And basically they go into this stealth mode in the blood system where this happens in humans too, where the body, the fish body, your body doesn't know they're there until these pathogenic organisms get to a certain population level, and then they basically quorum sense, where they release this molecule that tells them all to take the shields off, and now they're there and they appear. And by that time, they're outnumbering your immune system, and it leads to diseases. So actually, one course of study to help prevent human diseases is ways to prevent these bacteria from quorum sensing. Because if they can't quorum sense, they can't become virulent, to you. And that's the same. Well, that's kind of what we're trying to do here with the fish, is turn on the immune system before the bacteria get the upper hand.
Yes.
Because if you spend any time observing your fish, which is the whole reason to have them, so you know that when you get a new fish, most cases, it isn't the first day. The fish swims around, it's looking great, everything's fine, it's feeding, and then I've read it hundreds of times. Everything was great. I had my fish for 3 or 4 days, and now it's dead. What happened? Well, the bacteria got the upper hand. And by the time you see the fish covered in fuzz, or by the time you see the fish in the upper corner shimmying, its fins are all clamped, it's too late for most people, because you need to do a dip, you need to maybe even do an antibiotic injection. It's just you got to go into an emergency room treatment, and that's just not possible for many people.
Yeah.
So definitely add the first defense in the beginning, and add it actually daily. You can't really overdose. You don't want to always have an immune stimulant in there, but you're just doing the quarantine for a certain period of time. You don't have to add it every day, but you definitely want to give the fish an upper hand, and internally stimulating its immune system is a good thing to do during quarantine. That's a good question. Thanks for remembering that, Hillary.
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan of First Defense. It's one of those products that I always have on hand, no matter what. It's always there.
Yeah, it's a great. There's, like I say, the vitamins do a lot of things. There's a lot of antioxidants and vitamins, and they're just what you need in the water. And the nice thing about saltwater fish is, because they're always drinking the water, they can get that vitamins into their systems again internally, and that really helps, is to get the medications in, like with the food and stuff, internally, because you don't want to have the body organs infected. Once they're infected, nobody's doing a kidney transplant on a fish. Actually, I think somebody did that on a koi, but the koi was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah. So now you've gone through the 32 days since you've last seen anything. The fish is eating real well. Success. Now you can move it into your display tank. What do you do with the quarantine tank? Well, as I said many times, I prefer that you chlorinate it. Just the whole thing. It's just safer to just chlorinate the whole system, the biofilter, the marbles, the plastic plants, air stone, just everything. Just treat it all as if it's got stage 4 bacteria in there or something like that. And then rinse it all off and set it up again, and then restart the biofilter. Just a little bit of ammonia, just every few days. Remember, you're only going to have hopefully 1 or 2. You're not quarantining a whole bunch of fish in there, and so you don't need a huge biofilter, and you're ready to go should you get the urge, or if you've got to move something from your display tank into it, you're ready to go. Preparation is what's most important. You're prepared so you can deal with things.
Yes. Be less stressful for you in the long run if you've already got something up and running and ready. You're not like, oh, I've got to go to the store and buy a tank, and I've got to this and that.
Right. And I'm sure, as Hillary can tell you, all the bad events happen at the worst time. Right. They don't happen Saturday afternoon when you're just chilling. No, it's Friday night at 10 o'clock, something happens, or you come home from being out at night on a Saturday night, and you look at your tank and go, oh, what happened? What's wrong? And now you've got to go into panic mode.
It's never at a convenient time.
Never at a convenient time. Not that it's convenient, but it's just never at it's the stores are closed. You can't get a hold of any of your buddies. You're on your own, and the panic sets in.
Yep.
So being prepared, having a quarantine tank and the materials there is very important.
Exactly.
Now, I do want to mention, we haven't gone through, because we were talking about the tank and the setup. We didn't mention how to treat. And that's really something that depends in terms of what specific medications. There's a long list, and that's not something that we're going to delve in. If you have a friend that's a vet that can help you, some experienced people, that's going to be better than just us giving you a list of formulas on what things to use.
And two, I think a lot of it depends, even on availability, like what's near you, what are you able to find? Some places.
Right. And there are antibiotics out there, but like everything else these days, be careful about cheap medications.
Yes.
Unfortunately, there are unethical people out there that that are selling stuff that aren't the right doses, aren't the right concentrations, that have been adulterated. Deal with a reputable source when you're buying your medication. Someone someone who has experience, someone you can check out with other hobbyists to make sure. And if it's a super cheap price, that's just a flashing red flag. Run. There's a reason for that, folks. I'm telling you. Yeah.
Now, out of curiosity, I don't mean to put you on the spot for this. Do you know of any good online resources or places people can go to find some of this information if they're looking? They're like, okay, I think I've got this. I might need to medicate. Where would you recommend that they look?
Oh, you did put me on the spot.
While you think, I'll tell people, I know that there are fish veterinarians out there. There's one in California. Her name is Dr. Jessie Sanders. She is fantastic. She won't diagnose over the computer or anything, but if you call or if you go to her website, I know she's got a bunch of resources for vets across the country so that you could look for somebody perhaps in your area and maybe get some better local information.
Right. And there's the Florida Fish Farmers Association. And there's also, and if I get this wrong, they're going to be mad at me. The Florida University, it's it Florida State or University of Florida? Oops, sorry, folks. That has a fish station, and they have a lot of publications. They have a lot of vets that work there, and they've got a lot of publications on treating your fish, and that's a good source. University of North Carolina has a good vet school that does a lot of fish work. Mm-hmm. So you can look there.
Yeah, so there are resources available. Just take a little bit of time and look for them and see.
Yep.
Maybe steer away from forums and stuff.
Yeah, there's the internet's, the problem there. There's a lot of people out there that haven't any experience with any of this. So like, you want to know how to make medicated food? Go check out what Hilly was telling you about, how she's going to show you how to do it. People that have experience with this.
Yep.
All right. So maybe next on the quarantine, if people have questions, we can do a question and answer session. You can send us your questions to our social media links or info@drtimsaquatics.com. And we can do another session with answering people's specific questions that we didn't cover in this version of setting up in your quarantine tank.
I like that. That's a good idea. And I'm going to go ahead and shout out to Reefpalooza in Orlando. It's going to be 15th. So
yeah, not this weekend, next weekend.
Yep. So if you are in Orlando and you're going, we will be there. So come by and say hi.
Yeah.
Tell us you heard the podcast.
Yeah, I'll be there. So. All right, everyone. Thanks very much for listening. We appreciate it. Yep. And again, this has been Dr. Tim and Hilary with Dr. Tim's Aquatics podcast. Be safe and have a great day, everyone.